The Bible isn't just related to migration. The migration experience is so central to the Bible. Life choices didn't have much to do with personal preference. And I think in some ways we find parallel in Asian America. Look at our Asian American experience, not merely as a legitimate reading, but something that really gives us access to a new reading of biblical theology, to take our own experience and put that at the forefront, to understand the Bible as migration literature.
It is now my honor to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roger Nam, who will open our conference with his talk, Family, Migration, and Economic Survival in the Hebrew Bible, What If Honor Your Father Isn't the Whole Story? Roger Nam, PhD, is professor of Hebrew Bible and director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Emory University, Candler School of Theology. His scholarship bridges Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern history, with a focus on how economic and social realities shape biblical texts and communities. He is the author of multiple books, most recently The Theology of the Books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Before entering academia, he served as a pastor in Seoul, Korea, and worked as a financial analyst in Silicon Valley. This year marks his 18th year as a professor in theological education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Nam.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's the weirdest path ever. Highly unrecommended to go from, I was an econ major, and I felt a calling to be a pastor. And so I was a pastor in Seoul, Korea for 4 years, and kind of want to go back to the States and take a break from ministry. So I was a finance bro for 4 years in the Silicon Valley. With my MDiv, I entered corporate finance. And at some point I decided I think I want to be a Bible scholar. And so I went back to school. And after 7 short full-time years of graduate school, I got my first job in Oregon, where I lived for 12 years before moving to Atlanta. David, it's a great honor for this invitation, for this gathering. I think it's very important. Chloe and I actually were in a Hebrew reading group together many years ago when we were both graduate students. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit nervous talking about family in front of a marriage and family therapist who's coming after me. So I'm not going to look in this direction when I speak. So I'd like to just go ahead with the opening slide. Family, migration, divine presence. What is this? And what does it have to do specifically with what do we mean by family? And what do we mean by migration, economic survival? So I want you to just kind of hear these questions from whatever context you're at. Hear these questions. Where are you going to college? What is your major? What are you going to do after graduation? Where will you get a job? Where will you live? Are you dating anyone? When are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? Where are they going to college? What is their major? Like, you see the cycle, it goes on and on. Those are familiar questions in many Asian American contexts. And if you lived in ancient Israel, I have really good news and really bad news. The good news is those questions, which tormented us so much in our life, they were not questions in ancient Israel. The bad news is those questions were predetermined. They were answered for you by the oldest living patriarch on your father's side. Those weren't questions. There was no college, there was no major, and guess what? You married most likely a distant cousin. And I'll let you know your cousin is just as grossed out as you are about that, but that was part of marriage. Like, there's nothing about romance. These were determined not by your individual choice. They were determined by family systems, by hierarchies, by needs of the greater, larger family. And we talk about family, we're not talking about you and your siblings. We're talking about your first cousins, your aunts and uncles, but all on the patrilineal side. Life choices didn't have much to do with personal preference. That's actually kind of a new thing in the course of history. And these structures were very core to ancient Israel. And I think in some ways we find parallel in Asian America. I'd actually like to show you and kind of demonstrate today a little bit about how your experience, as diverse as Asian America is, your experience can be actually very different from mainstream experience and very similar to ancient Israel. So in the next slide, you see two pictures. One is from 1965 Seoul, Korea. So my mom and dad actually left Korea in 1967, I should say. And so you'd probably understand there was the Hart-Celler Act in 1965. It was taken into effect a few years later. It released quotas for immigration, and then that became a wave of immigration. But this is Korea in the 1960s. So I am still so amazed at what Korea is today and comparing Korea to what it was from when my mom and dad left. So when my mom and dad left, Korea, the GDP was very similar to many landlocked African countries at the time. It was very poor. It was very militarily oppressive. It was still under the wake of war. About 75% of the people relied on public transportation, which is amazing compared to Korea today. And you also think about the phenomenon of Korean culture in the globe. And so it is so, like even last weekend, a fictional K-pop band was on Saturday Night Live. Like that was last weekend. And to understand the phenomenon of Korean culture, it's really shocking. They even have a term for this for those Korean Americans like myself who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They recognize a sort of dissonance. Because back in the 80s, I will say K-pop was not great, I would say. K-drama was just a man and a woman talking in front of a bowl of rice for an hour, and that was the drama that they did at the time. The production value wasn't the same as it was today. And so there's a great dissonance even with food. We all have a complicated relationship with Asian foods. We have different experiences bringing them to these mainstream public schools and having different comments, having roommates. And it's just so there's a term of dissonance for those that experience something different in our childhood and what we experience now. But there's some things about our Asian American heritage that I think are very similar to ancient Israel. So in the bottom picture is a view from a place called Tel Azekah. It's in a place called the Shephelah, and it's near the Valley of Elah where Goliath was. And you can kind of see they ran to the Philistia states. And there's certain framings that I think are very important in terms of understanding, looking at our Asian American background and finding that it is very helpful. And so at places like Princeton, places like Emory, places like Fuller, there's a lot of great work in biblical scholarship that studies how we can interpret the Bible. But the majority of that work is done by scholars who come from a very particularized context that may not have access to our own experiences. So I'm here to say that not only is an Asian American lens appropriate and a legitimate reading, but it actually can give you great insight to the biblical text beyond mainstream scholarship. And to begin with the next slide, I would like to present the idea of the Bible not just having something to do with migration, but actually being foundational on the migration experience. Take, for example, Genesis. When I say the book Genesis, what do you think of? You think of creation. You think of the flood, and that is appropriate. But the vast majority of the book of Genesis is about one family and 3 generations of one family. And it's not a story. It actually takes place beginning from the migration. And so it's really about Abraham and about Jacob and about Joseph and how they made their way in these different foreign lands. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." And so maybe you could think of Genesis 1 through 11 as almost a prologue or preamble. God is powerful, God is sovereign, and is that God that walks along with Abraham and his family during this migration journey. It's not just about Abraham. It's about so much else, from beginning with the banishment from the Garden of Eden, to talk about the exodus from Egypt and the wanderings in the desert. They're the wanderings. They're landless. They're homeless. And you can think about the destruction of Samaria and the refugees going all over the place in the 8th century. You could think about the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century and refugees going to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to northern Levant, modern-day Syria and Turkey. In fact, the word diaspora is taken from the Bible, the Greek translation, and it refers to the diaspora from the destruction in 586 of Babylon. And it's not just the historical narratives. You could think about prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and much of Isaiah, which really center on the exile displacement experience. You could think about the Psalms, by the rivers of Babylon, where we wept and we remembered Zion, this kind of nostalgic of this is the home where we were. And the people who sang that song were often second generation, people that had never experienced Jerusalem, but remembered Zion from their elders. So the Bible isn't just related to migration. I'm actually going to argue that the migration experience is so central to the Bible, to every aspect, at least, of the Old Testament. And so that gives us, as Asian Americans, some sort of advantage in certain ways. If we go to the next slide, we'll see some pictures that are familiar to you. I actually Googled mapped Abraham's migration. And one thing you'll realize that we know, depending on how you migrated, our experience is different. So he had to do it by foot. And it's different when you travel by yourself and when you travel with all your belongings and your family. And so once I traveled, the first time my little one, who's now 22, my kid who's 22, when he was 11 months old, we took him to Korea. That was a terrible decision because he just learned to walk. And then I am not proud of this, but kind of proud of this. It was the first time we deliberately drugged him with Sudafed just to keep him down on the flight to Korea. And it worked. He fell asleep. It was awesome. But once I traveled with an infant, it made traveling solo so much better. I just appreciate, I look at these parents and I smile, like, it's so bad. But imagine traveling by foot across mountains. According to Google Maps, it's about 2,100 miles. He starts from and he goes to Haran with his family, with his dad. That's where his father's buried. And then he is told by God to go. And he goes to Shechem, he goes to different places, Bethel Ai, and then he goes on to Egypt. Not sure where, probably the Delta, because there's famine. And then he returns and goes by Hebron, and that's where he buries his wife. It's a long journey with all his things and all his family. And you can compare that to different journeys. On the next slide, you will see a picture of a really famous, iconic place. This is Angel Island Immigration Center in the top. And you can imagine the generation of Asians that came through San Francisco by boat at different periods, how the land was like, what the climate towards Asians was at the time. And you can see in the picture the Hart-Celler Act, which kind of released the quota, at least for my family, to begin their immigration journey. And you compare that with today. Like most families, the vast majority come to 5 places when they immigrate: LAX, San Francisco, Honolulu, Chicago, and JFK in New York. The vast majority of Asians come through those 5 places. And you look and you can understand the generational difference. If you came at the conclusion of the Hart-Celler Act in the 1960s or 1970s, what were your reasons for migration? The reasons were actually family reunification was a huge one. So my aunt, my dad's older sister, she came in the 1950s married to a GI. So during the Korean War, she married an American soldier, and she came to this, and she was an exception to the quota. And then as soon as the quotas were released, then my father had permission with my mom to come to the United States. And so the main reason was reunifying families and political refugees. Those were the 2 main points of view in terms of ratifying this act and allowing access. Today, what is the main reason for immigration and migration from Asia? By far, it is education. Not just Princeton Seminary, but all sorts of places. And of course, it's getting harder and complex, but by far. And so that leads to a different type of migration experience, right? Also, what do you know about migration in the 1960s and 70s? I only know about Korea, but I know that it was a struggling economy, and the government was very, very tight at letting cash leave the nation of Korea. And so people came without a lot, compared to today where you need to bring money into America so you can spend it and produce our cars. So very different reasons. And I think we all have an innate sense of migration and how complex it is, depending on the generation, depending on how you come, depending on the country of origin. Imagine Korea in 1965 versus Korea today as the 11th largest GDP in the world. And also your mode of migration, when you come when you're 5 years old, or if you come when you're 50 years old. We also understand that migration is a totalizing experience. It impacts everything. Nothing goes untouched. And it is generational. Just because you're born in the States, or even if your parents were born in the States, you're still part of that migration experience. So you see the resonance with Genesis. Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. Isaac gets a little bit, but he's not, doesn't have a lot there. We understand also that migration is different if you're embodied as an Asian American. So different from, say, the great Polish migration or the Irish migration or the Italian migration. There are different challenges to assimilation because of the way that we're embodied. We cannot hide it as easily, and certainly we cannot assimilate, at least in the perception of others, in migration, and that carries on to generation. And a lot of us in the second generation, we know no matter how good your verbal SAT score is, your English is always suspect in certain ways. It's always suspect. We're counting on you, third generation. All right, okay, we're not, it's okay. So let's look at family life a little bit. I actually have a reconstruction, the next slide, of a house in ancient Israel. And so in the big picture, that is a reconstruction of something called a four-room house. And this is found all over Israel during the time of the Bible. Sometimes they're three-room houses, sometimes they're four-room houses. And every excavation, almost every excavation, you could see in the domestic area the upper slide of what you remain. It doesn't look like much, but you can make up walls. You can see what a residence was, and they have a reconstruction at the bottom. And so this domestic house, and this is in the Eretz Museum in Tel Aviv, it's just a reconstruction, looks quaint. Okay, let me tell you about life in this house. It was a small four-room house, maybe 500 square feet, maybe 700 square feet. It often had a second floor because it was load-bearing walls that they had, and seems pretty nice and livable. Okay, let me stop you right there. 4 rooms, the middle room was most likely for the patriarch. The grandfather and the grandmother, they lived in that room together. 1 room, the eldest son and his wife and his children. The other room, the second son and his wife and his children. The 4th room, the animals. You know, it snows in Jerusalem about once every other year. Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet above sea level. And so it is cold, it gets cold in many parts of Israel. And so the animals were a way to kind of create some warmth. I'm sure it smelled terrible, but that was most of life at the time. And you also stored things. You know, there's famine, right? So in ancient Israel, how often was there complete no crop situation? It talks a lot about famine. It talks a lot about drought. It talks a lot about pestilence. Well, one estimate is 3 out of every 10 years was a 0 crop in ancient Israel, which means you need to have storage. And you actually find these things in archaeological sites, silos of storage where you can kind of live in case there is a bad year. And of course, the animals, you could always slaughter an animal in case you had drought or something like that. So privacy, like what's that? Like that's that you lived and this was a center of your life. And if you have other sons, you would find a space, but you also know that mortality was so high. If you made it to adulthood with 2 adult sons, you're doing pretty well. And so you're asking, what about the daughters? When you marry, you go to your husband's house and you become part of that household. And literally in Korean, when a woman gets married, the language is different. If a man gets married, it's like you're going to your father's house. That's what it means to get married. And so, and this happened at 14, 15, as soon as you're close to childbearing age. And this, again, was not your decision. This was something done by the laws and the values and mainly by the patriarch's negotiations. So this was typical family life. And so decisions on what you did, what to major, or what you were going to go to college, they're not there, but the underlying reason is there. This was an honor-shame society. And this is what makes the prodigal son so stunning in Luke 15. You had honor, this obligation. It's something that was always hard to explain to your white friends why you need to do something. It's just because your parents expect that from you. And there's some deeply rooted value. And those honor-shame values, I think, in a large extent, governed Israel family life. you can't not just leave and run away and get a job in New York. That wasn't, or in Jerusalem or in Samaria, that just wasn't an option. And you worked in an agrarian setting as long as your body was able. So you start with shepherding sheep. You can actually see this today in Israel with Bedouin families, shepherding, where you have a lot of downtime, you work, you would cook, try to make meal from grain. And so it was a very hard life, and there were very deep expected values, and they were necessary for economic survival. And as I said, it was deeply patriarchal. Now, this also resonates in Korean dramas even from the 1980s. There's always this odd relationship with the wife and the mother-in-law and the father-in-law. The mother-in-law is vilified. The father-in-law is kind of a little bit more nurturing in certain ways. There's a really well-known Old Testament professor who's retired, Dr. Catherine Sockenfeld, and she once went to Korea to speak on the book of Ruth. She goes to Korea, and the women say, we don't want to hear the book of Ruth. And she's so puzzled. And she asks why, and they say, we're tired of our mother-in-laws reading to us from the book of Ruth. So please, how about something different, like Ezekiel or something like that? But it makes sense, and these carry over to our experiences. Another aspect of family life, we go to burials. And so the next slide shows something. It's a very famous slide for all the wrong reasons. And so this is called the Garden Tomb. If you've been to Jerusalem and gone on a tour, there's a good chance you've gone to the Garden Tomb because it's claimed to be the tomb of Jesus. I have some terrible news for you. This is absolutely 100% not the tomb of Jesus. It's impossible. This is actually most likely an 8th century BC tomb. So something during the time of Amos or Hosea. Some people date it much later, but you cut out these tombs in rock and you would have family burials. So what you would do is, when you're living in a household like this, and there are many houses like that next to each other, it's a tribe of people, and the Bible uses that very language. So you're very familiar with death in ways that we're not so familiar with death nowadays. And so when someone dies, what do? You bury them, and then the body decomposes, and then you put them in a secondary burial with the ancestors. And so in the Bible, when it talks about Judean and Israelite kings, that has the term, and he lay with his fathers. And he lay with his fathers, and he slept with his fathers. And you remember when Josiah is killed, there are different accounts whether he was buried in Jerusalem or buried somewhere else. So where you're buried is very meaningful. And it's very meaningful to be buried with your fathers. So what that means is, after your body decomposes, they dig you up, and they put your remaining bones with the other bones. So I'm not going to show you the slide, but they actually have found these places of these piles of bones. And you could think about these are very visible family plots. And so it is meaningful because you're literally looking at this every day. You see these plots every day, and you know that your remains are going to go join with that plot at some time, and that is a good burial. So in Job, when it talks, I know my Redeemer lives, there's actually, I think that's fine theologically to interpret in different ways, but in its original formulation, there's an idea that the Redeemer is the one to take care of the person's bones at burial, because that was so meaningful to the person. You could also think about migration. So I have a family plot in Korea. I can go there if I'm pretty sure it's not my decision, but think about it. Abraham left Ur. His father was buried in modern-day Syria. His wife was buried in Shechem. There's a disjointed identity. That family plot is long gone and abandoned, never to be entered again by the family. There's something very new, which, if you look at Asian American life, probably the same thing that we would expect as well. Sorry to ruin the burial for you that go to Jerusalem. That's not the tomb. Okay, next slide. What about economic life? It wasn't so much flourishing, it was survival. I have a dirty secret for you. Whenever the Old Testament says the word money, it's not referring to money, it's referring to silver. Money wasn't invented until the late 7th century. It appeared in Turkey. It never appeared in Israel until the very end of the 5th century, 400. And when it did appear, it's just a few examples. It was extremely rare. And once the Greco-Roman period came, it began to become ubiquitous. It was all over the place. And apparently that's part of the reason why Jesus and the Old Testament seem to have contradictory ideas about money. When you talk about blessing in the Old Testament, it almost always refers to material blessing because money had not been invented yet. And so what you see there is a shekel weight. This was actually discovered just a few years ago, and it says 2 shekels on there. And a shekel was anywhere between 7 to 11 grams, depending where you were. And so people exchanged through different things by money. And so we actually have a couple of texts to give you some ideas of different economies at the time. The very top right is something called the Gezer calendar. This is probably a late 10th or 9th century text. It's written on limestone. Writing was very rare at the time. This is one of 3 examples that we have in Israel. And this is written in some weird form of Hebrew, but it talks about an agricultural calendar. It talks about 12 months. It refers to barley. It refers to grain. It refers to summer fruit. It refers to flax. It refers to pruning. And so it's one calendar to refer to all these different products. So what does it tell you? It actually tells you that family farming life was very diversified. And that makes sense in a world without money because you have to diversify to feed your family. If you're growing what you eat, you can't just eat one crop. You have to have different things. And so this refers to these different crops. This has an idea of different agricultural products and probably some animals as well in case of locusts or in case of drought. You could always slaughter a few animals and then eat and feed off the meat and the milk of those animals. And so that is in probably the 10th century. You go to the 8th century, the next is something called the Samaria ostraca. So Samaria was excavated in the early 20th century. If you ever go into excavation, I know there are opportunities here at Princeton. There's so much pottery everywhere. And they had this pottery and they're cleaning this out. So you dip it in water, you soak it for a few hours, and then you brush it away from you. So they're doing this in Samaria in the early 20th century. They're brushing away this pottery, and then at some point they see this writing. And they, and they go through all the pottery and wash it all, and they look for writing. And they came up with over 100 different examples of writing, a form of Hebrew that's similar to the Bible. And the top text, one of 3 examples, 5 or 6 product. The bottom text, it's in the 8th century, hundreds of examples. And if you actually go in Israel, there are thousands of examples of writing in the 8th century. And it refers not to 6 products, not to 5, not to 4, not to 3. It refers to only 2 products, oil and wine. And it doesn't just say oil and wine. It says something like washed oil, which means really nice olive oil. And it says aged wine, which means more alcohol, more fermented wine. And so it tells you something about the economy. At one point, it was very diversified, very family friendly, where you can raise enough to feed your family. But at another point, it was specialized. It was on 2 crops, olive oil and wine. And it wasn't just olive oil and wine. So what they mean by washed oil or sometimes good oil, and so in a family with 10 members, you would crush olives and you would just kind of skim off the oil, and that's what you would use, and you'd probably do that every day. But what they found in the 8th century is these installations, these giant vats where they'd pour in all these olives and they would crush them. At the very top, you would skim off the nice oil. So you could actually translate this as extra virgin olive oil. Something like it's the nicest olive oil that they had. And the quantities are actually pretty small. The aged wine is meaningful because to ferment wine, to ferment it more, you need to ferment it for longer. It's more costly to produce. It's more expensive. So it's a nicer wine. So these were wines that were delivered to officials at the time to get some sort of political favor. So the idea is at one point you have a diversified economy, the family chipping in. At another point, you have actually a really hard life because you're only making olive oil and wine, and you're probably depending on some sort of deliveries from the government to give to you. So the top is a very subsistence economy. The bottom is a very centralized economy. And we in fact know that people had quotas. They had to provide a certain amount of olive oil, otherwise they wouldn't get receipts from the Assyrians, they wouldn't get favor, they wouldn't get provisions, they wouldn't get the other sustenance. And if there's a time of need, guess who's getting the food? It's not the Israel families, it is the soldiers of the Assyrian army. And in fact, Isaiah talks about this in many ways, about combining homes. You could look up olive oil and wine in Hosea, in Amos. These sources of blessing become kind of a curse because they're being unjustly wielded at this time. Aspects of honor and shame are deeply embedded in this economy that depends on survival. So as I got older, as I had my own kids, my own third generation kids, I began to have a lot more sympathy and empathy for my parents and realizing what is it like to fly in for my mother through Alaska to San Francisco, for my mom and dad, to not have much money. There's no internet. They probably saw some black and white pictures of America, but they have no idea. And they're not carrying much. There's no Duolingo. They don't speak English. They have no sense of what this place is. There's certainly expectations, and some of those expectations are great, and some of those expectations will be shattered. What is it like to be embodied as an Asian and to walk around in a new place in America in the 1960s not speaking the language? And also to understand, as I thought more about this, my name is Nam. That's a terrible name to have in the 1960s and 70s. It's a really bad name to have, and I understand that. I understand why that was met with so much. There are stories that I remember of my older cousins talking about my father and saying, we're so proud of your dad, because we would see him getting in fights with white guys all the time. I'm like, what? That was, but I could understand more. I have more empathy towards that. And I think that is a deep part of understanding these dynamics, developing that level of empathy. The only time I said empathy is the only time I made eye contact with you. But I think that's part of the interpretive process. So the Bible, to look at our Asian American experience, not merely as a legitimate reading, but something that really gives us access to a new reading of biblical theology, to take our own experience and put that at the forefront, to understand the Bible as migration literature and explore these avenues of daily family life. And I think we could look at the Bible in certain different ways. And so the next slide, a few verses. Of course, honor your father and mother is a commandment, but there's so much more in the Bible beyond that. Ezra 3. And all the people responded with a great shout. And when they praised the Lord, all people who had seen the first house on its foundations wept with a loud voice. So you have generational conflict in the most extreme ways in Ezra 3. You have some people who had never seen the temple, and they built the temple, and they're so excited, they're so happy. Now we have our God. But the elders who saw it for the first, and they had to be at least 47 years old at the time, they saw the original temple. They're like, this is nothing. And so the same event engenders two completely polar opposite responses. Nehemiah 13, I always felt this is the most Asian American verse ever. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various peoples. I have to admit to you, I am a Saturdays Korean school dropout from Korean United Methodist Church in Novato. And I went on Saturdays. I was terrible, and I dropped out. But you can kind of feel the loss of identity. You could feel it especially because now sociologists know if you don't have the language within a few generations, your identity is gone. And it's so hard to reinforce that. So both my kids were born in LA. Both my kids, we were so adamant that we wanted them to speak Korean, so Korean was their first language. My older was 5 when he moved from Los Angeles, where he went to daycare in Koreatown. My wife worked in Koreatown. We went to church in Koreatown, and he moved to Portland, Oregon. And he started kindergarten at a public school. And within 1 month, he switched languages, perfectly. And I don't blame him. Of course, he wants to speak the language of all his friends. It's natural. It's not even a conscious decision. But the loss that you can imagine was felt. And you can imagine the loss our parents feel as well when we don't speak the language. I want to present to you in the very final slide this idea. You have a senior person reading the Bible with notes. It's the book of Genesis. And so you bring your context and you read the Bible through whatever your Asian American context is, you read the Bible and you bring that. At Emory, I teach an undergraduate class as well called The Bible in Asian America. And I had this student, she's from Seattle, she's Indian, not a Christian, and never read the Bible before. So she's reading the New Testament for the first time. And it's like, and I'm like, so what do you think? And she's like, wow, the Apostle Paul, he sounds like an Indian dad to me. He talks about shame, he's disappointed, he's very insulting. Like, yeah, okay, that's a legit reading. You read the Bible through your own lens. But you know what else? The Bible reads you. And so what I want to offer to you to take the fullness of your Asian American experience and open up the fullness of your Asian American congregations and communities and bring that to the interpretation of the text, because it's new. It's not in biblical scholarship until very, very recently. And to also, I would say there are parts of the Bible that will read you. When you read, what we will do later is explore the life of one family in Jacob. There are aspects of his life and his family dynamics that can shed light into your own understanding, that can engender a sort of empathy towards people in your family and can kind of validate some of the experiences, your identity formation that you have right now, because it's not just tangential, but the migration experience is fundamental to the Bible narrative arc in all genres of the Bible. So if anything from today to help walk with you alongside, as you read the Bible, let the Bible read you. All right? Thanks.